Hi class, this is lecture 18 for Econ 4001.02 and I'm your professor, John Raybeck. So let's get started. This lecture is just going to cover two topics. So first we're going to discuss production problems and what it means to study production. So here we're going to be looking at things like if I have a set of inputs and outputs, then what can I construct or make or produce from these inputs. And we're going to lay out two approaches here that we'll go into in more depth throughout the following couple of weeks. So these are going to be profit maximization and cost minimization. So let's get started with production. So before we just considered a single consumer, and while that was fine and made a lot of sense, this time for production, we're going to consider the firm's production problem. So this is going to be how much should a firm produce in order to, fulfill some objective. And here we're going to talk about a firm in an abstract sense. So we're going to treat the firm as though it's a single decision maker, even though the firm may be produced of many people, right? So there might be managers and employees and people who work specialized jobs. But to start out, we're just going to assume that all of these share the same objective. So we're going to be talking about essentially an individual as a firm and a firm as an individual within the class. We're going to use two approaches or two objectives to think about a firm trying to optimize. And these will be profit maximization and also cost minimization. So profit maximization will be something like, what is the most that I can produce? Or how much should I produce for given inputs in order to maximize the money I make, right? So there's going to be some function that defines how much you produce from inputs, and inputs will have a cost here. And we'll also consider cost minimization. So this is going to be something like subject to producing at least Y units of output, what inputs should I use to produce this when the inputs cost some prices? Right, so these two problems make some intuitive sense for things that we think a firm will actually want to optimize, and that's why these are kind of the two standard approaches. So first we're going to go over primitives. So in the production environment, things are going to be named slightly differently, right? So here we're going to let x, and this is again going to be a two-dimensional vector in the non-negative orthant, be the inputs or factors of production, right? So these x are the things that we're going to use to create something. So if we're trying to create something like, say, cement, x1 might be limestone, and x2 might be electricity used to create heat needed for the production process. We're going to define y now as an output. So this is the thing we're producing. So again, in the cement case, y might be cement. And we're going to think that outputs are produced by some function, right? So f is going to be our production function, and this is going to take inputs and turn them into outputs, right? So you can, some examples of this are maybe producing cement from limestone and energy, producing bicycles from bicycle tires and bicycle frames. It can be a lot of things. Producing knowledge from time spent reading and time spent sleeping. You can use this to model a lot of different things. It's really, just up to how creative you are to think of things that you think are important to include in this production process. And finally, we're going to have some parameters. So our output price is going to be given by this P. So it's important to note that this P is not a vector anymore. This is just a scalar, right? So it's a one-dimensional object. And we'll also have input prices W, which is now, this vector valued object. So W will include the price of input 1 and the price of input 2. Great. So unlike utility and dealing with that, production is actually cardinal, right? So we can plausibly measure the units of output. So if I would take a monotonic transform, say, of a production function or profit, this is actually going to say something about, the firm getting more money or less money, depending on what type of monotonic transform you take, right? So this is going to be cardinal. This means that we can't take those monotonic transforms. And again, this differs from utility where only the order matters. So we'll be able to compare firms through profit or costs because these are all going to be in the same unit. And just remember that, before utility was ordinal, and that allowed us to simplify some things. One last important thing to note is that prices are supposed to contain information about opportunity cost. So we should be able to, if we're really thinking about prices, we should know whether our resources could be better used for some other production process when factoring this into a price. And this is particularly important these days because, when just thinking about use of natural resources, for example, using something like coal may be cheap monetarily, but its economic cost might actually be very high because it's affecting other people. And if you don't include and their health, right? So things like air pollution are shown to reduce health outcomes for all kinds of groups of people. So if coal contributes to air pollution, then we should build in the effects of the air pollution on others when calculating a price for this, right? Because this is supposed to be a price of opportunity cost. So if others are suffering, then we might want to include this price into that. And this is really where, there's a potential role for government, right? So there might be opportunity in the costs. Firms don't take these into account. And then the government can try and make them take them into account by creating tax policies and things like this. Great. So now that we've covered like the important things about the different setup of production, now we're going to consider our two types of problems. So the first one is just profit maximization. And this is going to be for a production function f, we consider profit maximization as maximizing the profit you make from output minus the cost of the inputs, subject to the inputs you use being able to produce at least as much of the output that you have, right? So note that the objective is increasing with y, right? So you always will want to have y be equal to the amount that you can produce from the production process. So we'll have f of x equals y. But this means that we can simplify the problem to only depend on inputs, right? So profit maximization is going to be a problem where we actually don't have to worry about constraints. And this will sometimes make our life easier and sometimes make our life harder, as we'll see in later lectures. The other type of problem that we're going to talk about is going to be cost minimization. So here, for a production function f, we're going to consider minimizing costs. So costs now just depend on W1, oh, and this should be W2. I'll fix that in some updated slides. But such that the input produces at least the amount y that you want to produce. And an important thing to note is this y is in our constraint set, but it's not being optimized over, right? So here, it's important to note that output is actually a parameter for cost minimization. And this means we can look at things like comparative statics with respect to output when thinking about costs. And this will show up later on in these next few weeks. Anyway, this brings us to the recap. So we discussed production problems and some fundamental assumptions, and we discussed the two types of problems we're going to study for production. So these are going to be, again, profit maximization and cost minimization. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.